Hi everyone, welcome to week 10. Today we're going over chapter 8, which is going to be covering events in our history of sport between 1920 and 1950. And there's a lot of different things that happened during this time. Obviously, there's a lot of scandals, which if you read the textbook, you're able to see a lot more detail about what these scandals are, but a lot of them are extremely politicized. A lot of them are very much kind of allowing this critical aspect of America kind of flourish in a lot of spaces. And this happened initially, at the end of the Gilded Age, people really wanted to break down these systems of power, of hierarchy, economic stratification, but now people are doing so with the more political lens, that the ideological changes that are happening, these scandals are really kind of allowing people to be very critical of these systems of America, the systems of capitalism, these systems of WASP reform. And so there's a lot of things that happen in and out of sport that kind of emulate this challenge. We also find that this is a time of a lot of advancements in technology. We have the very first radio broadcast, very first talking movie, the first solo transatlantic flights from Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart. But most notably, during these 30 years, in 1929, we have the stock market crash, which signals the beginning of the Great Depression. In 1935, we have FDR's New Deals being established. And between 1941 and 1945, the United States was involved in World War II, which in 1945, the United Nations was founded. And so again, a lot of the things that are happening in this era in terms of international expansion, world powers are very geopolitically motivated, are very internationally motivated, ideologically motivated. And so we see this a lot in this sports timeline, in which, again, as we go forward into this space, as sport becomes more and more modern, more and more like it is in the modern day that all of you are learning about this class, the things that we see now are much more recognizable in the sense that people are documenting things now more than ever as we continue through this class. And so these sports timeline pieces are going to come much more frequently. But overall, what I want us to be mindful of is that for a lot of the familiar sports during this era, for baseball, this is the Babe Ruth era. We also have our very first All-Star game. The MLB starts playing night games, which was due to the previous invention of the light bulb. We have the very first televised game during this time. Jackie Robinson was integrated. We have the creation of Little League, and the All-American Girls Baseball League was formed during this era. For intercollegiate football, this was the era of Red Grange and the Four Horsemen. The very first college all-star game happened during this era, as well as the very first Heisman Trophy was awarded, which is arguably the most challenging award to earn in football, but also arguably in sports. For basketball, we have the Harlem Globetrotters on tour. The NCAA March Madness basketball bracket tournament starts. The New York Wrens, which are an all-black team, are the champions of professional basketball. For golf, we have our very first Masters tournament, and the Ladies Players Golf Association, the LPGA, was formed. For the Olympics, we had our very first Olympics held in 1924, in which ice skating was the only event. We also have the Los Angeles Olympics held. Women athletes completely dominated all of the American medals that were earned. We also had the Hitler Olympics, or the Berlin 1936 Olympics held, in which Jesse Owens and other Jewish athletes had protests. We also had famous golf, tanning, and boxing and swimming stars as well. And so all this to say that there's a lot of things that happen during this era that were kind of established because of these America shaky foundations. Again, after the Roaring Twenties, a lot of American progressive dreams were shattered due to a lot of things that happened, obviously due to the graphic, inhumane, and devastating effects of World War I. But we also see that the sanctity of sport was demolished during this previous era as well. In 1919, we have what's called the Black Sox scandal, and it really challenged this idea of morality in sport. That in 1919, the Chicago White Sox were the team that was essentially supposed to win the World Series at that time against the Cincinnati Reds, and they were paid off to throw the World Series. They were approached by gangsters that wanted to kind of trick the gambling system, and so these bookies came up to the Chicago White Sox players and asked them to throw the game. And if they threw the game, again, because they were the winners, so there was going to be a lot of people betting, not a lot of people betting against them, but they were throwing the game. So in order for them to throw the game, they lost the World Series, and they were eventually found criminally charged because they were working with mobsters and that they were promoting a nefarious agenda. And so those two things happened kind of at the same time, in the sense that people were kind of afraid of this idea that the world was no longer moral, that people were no longer good. And so progressives really tried to reframe sport and represent this idea of meritocracy during this era, that power is created by merit. The idea that if you work hard enough that you're able to achieve your dreams, right? A lot of us maybe can think of this as the American dream, but we see this much more simplistically in sport with the idea of meritocracy. So a lot of reformers during this time also tried to resurrect the ideas of opportunity and mobility, that the idea that if you're really good at sports, you're able to achieve upward social mobility and get a better life for yourself. And so sports writers really threw themselves at what we call golden people, aka star athletes during this time, to really represent these new ideals of sport. And so athletes were often heroes within their own ethnic or religious minority communities, right? And so that was really powerful to have that representation. But I want us to really focus on two examples to really kind of highlight how these names and images and people were utilized to progress this new American agenda. And so the first we're going to talk about is Babe Ruth. So Babe Ruth very much represented the American dream, the idea that a lot of sports writers talked about how he came from a working class background and he pulled himself up by his bootstraps and was able to succeed in professional baseball and was able to earn so much money by doing so. This is the land of opportunity, and the idea of meritocracy is heavily utilized to achieve upward social mobility, particularly in sport. But it's also important for us to recognize, too, that Babe Ruth did not come from a working class family. He came from a middle class, upper class family. And the reason why he was able to succeed so well in sport was because people were coaching him, that he got the equipment to be successful in baseball. And so even all this time in which we see sports being utilized to progress an agenda, they often fabricate the truth of these stories in order to do so. Another example of this is the Four Horsemen of Notre Dame, in a different sense in which, yes, they still represent these American ideals of spirit, teamwork, and assimilation. They did so because they were Catholic. Notre Dame is a Catholic university, a Catholic institution. And so having them kind of be the icons of collegiate football during this era was a way to say, oh, we've increased our tolerance. See, we like people from other backgrounds. But we don't really see that in other spaces outside of this kind of fabricated world of sports writing. And so as we kind of continue on, I want us to be very critical of this, what we call golden age of sports. And so the idea that a lot of sports writers kind of took advantage of the ideologies and agendas that were being pushed by these WASP reformers by utilizing sport to do so. And so even though this was kind of the main push, that this idea that, again, sports writers were kind of using sport to progress this new WASP agenda, there are a lot of challenging factors to this progression, and one of them is this idea of a domestic emphasis, the idea that, again, we no longer wanted to be a world power, that after World War I, the United States declined entry into the League of Nations and decided to fix domestic problems, and so that PowerPoint of international expansion stopped. Additionally, we had a time of limited immigration, and so immigrants from Europe and Asian nations were limited on entering due to these fears of losing WASP values, and so we lost a lot of PowerPoints internationally due to that as well, focusing inward. This was also the time of the communist scare, in which communists, socialists, and anarchists really ran rampant because people were very critical of this system. Like, how could our government create something that was so devastating like the Great Depression? Why did the stock market crash? Why did we monopolize and really concentrate these PowerPoints into a certain amount of companies? And so that really kind of created this anarchist kind of countercurrent to capitalism, which comes in the form of socialism, anarchism, and communism. And so the government created the Red Scare to basically detain anyone that disagreed with capitalist values. They detained rebels, and really did so because they didn't want an uprising on their hands. They wanted to maintain law and order under the veil of capitalism, these WASP ideologies. But during this time as well, even though there was limited immigration, there was more of a domestic emphasis, we still see ethnic celebration in sport, in which immigrants and working class citizens really became the main subject of their own rhetoric, in which they were the heroes of their sports movies. They were the heroes of sports, and not necessarily white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, as was kind of the goal of government infrastructure at this time. Additionally, the Great Depression was also very challenging, in which the stock market crash of 1929 really threw the U.S. and the world into a depression, with near majority of Americans unemployed and poverty, and really began this protest of the government. And FDR really kind of saved this system because he created the New Deal and really gave a lot of people employment through the government. And so we see a lot of nationalistic kind of adherences because people were desperate to make money. And so because they got hired by the government, because they started to work for their government systems, that kind of inferred this loyalty to capitalism and our American society. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say, World War II erased all of the ails of the stock market crash and the Great Depression because both men and women were working to supply for the war efforts while reestablishing these nationalist ideals into work and sport. And so again, a lot of things happened during this era to kind of ebb and flow the power points of this new golden age. And one of them is this idea of sport and religion, in which again, this was an era of much greater tolerance and celebration of different religious groups in sport. And I think a lot of that is kind of, again, this pick your battles sort of thing, in which a lot of WASP performers were recognizing that after the stock market crash, after the Great Depression, people were falling out of faith with WASP ideologies and these American values. And so they started to say, okay, let's have greater tolerance for different folks, people that are different than us. And so we see that in the form of sport. For Catholics, football in particular, this was the era of Coach Knute Rockne and the Notre Dame football team, really kind of having a lot of dominance in intercollegiate football space, and it really allowed for a lot of religious prejudice surrounding Catholicism to be dismantled. And it was very symbolic because football is a team sport, so it obviously kind of, again, touts these values of teamwork, self-sacrifice, group goals, which are very American, but it also allowed Notre Dame and Knute Rockne and kind of Catholics overall to be represented as the underdogs, much like America during much of our history. And so it stood for nationalism, toughness, courage, and other associated values that are really recognizable in the sporting space. We also have CYO, which is kind of the Catholic counterpart to the YMCA. So this stands for the Catholic Youth Organization. And so CYO provided a space for Catholics to combat delinquency through sport, namely through boxing and basketball, just like WASP Protestants and reformers did with the YMCA, and generally gaining mainstream acceptance through those sports listed. So again, this was a time of greater tolerance, not only for Catholics, but also for Jewish folks, that again, through boxing and basketball became very popular sports for Jewish men to kind of stay out of trouble, again, earn a living, and generally gain mainstream acceptance. But kind of continuing on our conversation from last week, in which a lot of Jewish boxers and even basketball players changed their name to be more Americanized, more generally accepted into mainstream white America. So although we do find greater acceptance, not necessarily the true cultural acceptance, because they're still kind of adhering to these WASP ideals. We also see in the sporting context kind of this ascendancy of Black culture, in which it was really marked by the Harlem Renaissance during this era that very heavily influenced Black sport. And so the Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual and cultural revival of African American music, dance, art, fashion, theater, literature, politics, and sport centered in Harlem, Manhattan, New York City, spanning the 1920s and 1930s, that very much emphasized Black pride, self-esteem, and economic independence from white systemic institutions. And so sports were kind of utilized as one of the mediums to establish that freedom, that independence, and power amongst a space that is, again, very systemically preventing equal opportunity in and out of sport. And so basketball, we see a lot of Black teams from New York and Chicago showing excellence. For baseball, you have segregated leagues for folks of color, so it's not only a place for African Americans, but also Hispanic and Caribbean athletes a chance to play baseball due to segregation that was felt during the MLB at this time. They did maintain economic independence by playing at stadiums that they built themselves, marking their success as a Black enterprise by and for them. We also have football, which again allowed for general mainstream acceptance, except when competing against Southern teams. And really this is to kind of maintain what they call the gentlemen's agreements, in which they would leave their Black athletes at home while they were playing Southern institutions. And so this was unfortunately a survival mechanism in which a lot of Southern colleges, Southern teams had death threats out if they saw any Black athletes playing against their white schools. And so this was something that was done out of self-preservation due to the extremely racist treatment that a lot of Black athletes and Black people still experienced in the South. And then finally, for boxing, it was still extremely competitive, although they would have to wait for Joe Louis for true desegregation to happen in the sport, not at the expense of humiliation that we've seen with desegregation in boxing previously. It is also important at the end of this era to acknowledge that desegregation did occur, in which the NFL was the very first professional sport organization to desegregate in 1946, the MLB in 1947, and then the NBA in 1950. It did, because of this desegregation, kind of allow or force the Harlem Globetrotters to seek novelty outside of the United States, in which they had international tours in order to still have a lot of financial reward for traveling and being a good basketball team. It's also important for us to recognize that for a lot of sports during this era, they still had a lot of specific power points. And so, like I mentioned last week, baseball was becoming a lot more structured, a lot more regimented. And so the social significance of baseball grew exponentially during this era. And baseball for the longest time has been regarded as America's national game. However, as we've talked about before, people soon lost favor with the sport for many different reasons. So in terms of scandal, the 1919 Black Sox scandal proved that sport wasn't a sacred moral place, as kind of the whole point of a lot of WASP performers utilizing sport to tout this idea of morality and temperance. That was just false. It was just a facade that was, again, more politically, ideologically motivated, that a lot of people no longer fell for anymore. We also have drinking, which is, again, as we talked about last week, the National League is very much marred by this kind of stereotype and this expectation of being a very rowdy drinking behavioral culture. And oftentimes, a lot of the people who own National League teams were actually brewing companies, which, if, again, any of us in the professional baseball space, the Milwaukee Brewers being one of those teams in which they were owned and regulated by a brewing company for beer. This was also a time in which a lot of people perceived baseball players as being unpatriotic as well, in which they accused baseball players as being unpatriotic because they got jobs in the war industry instead of the war front during World War I. The idea that they are not true Americans, they're not patriots because they're not putting their body on the line for democracy against the Western and Eastern fronts. And so they really wanted to change this idea, which, again, this idea of the golden age of sport is very much kind of a contrived cultural space in which a lot of sports writers really emphasize these ideas of American democracy, of capitalism, of patriotism, nationalism, by reaffirming these things in sports. And so in terms of kind of addressing these unpatriotic athlete perspectives, they started to require baseball to be much more patriotic, and that they started to require the Star-Spangled Banner to be played at World Series games, and then subsequently every other baseball game thereafter, which is a trend that we still see in most sport competitions, period. Even if it's something as small as a minor league or even a youth sporting team, that the ideas of patriotism and sport go hand in hand. And this is really, again, due to the fact that people wanted to reaffirm these WASP values in a time that people were no longer following these ideas. And so, again, sports writers really started to idealize the athletes with these new American values that, again, Babe Ruth really became the very first celebrity athlete. He was sensationalized for his home run dominance at 714, but his fabricated life story made it challenging for people to really trust the media and trust our politicians who create these fabricated stories in order to perpetuate a certain ideal, particularly with the idea of meritocracy and the American dream. We also have Jackie Robinson, who was the racial pioneer, what we call the guinea pig of desegregation in professional sports, particularly with baseball, which did at the time hold significantly more social power than football, even though football desegregated first. And so through his courage and leadership skills, dignity, and athleticism, it proved Coach Ricky's great experiment was enough to be a catalyst in much needed change in American society, that this experiment also trailblazed the way for other Black athletes and owners to really take mainstream acceptance in the sporting space. And so this leads into our documentary, really kind of reaffirming these ideas that we talked about today, debunking the idea that politics and sports separation doesn't really exist, specifically within race and sport. And so we're watching about the documentary in terms of Joe Louis, I believe, and if not Jack Johnson, and then Jackie Robinson as well. So what two athletes directly challenged white supremacist values? Specifically, how did Jackie Robinson conform to these American ideals of the WASP American ideals? But then what happened that made Jackie Robinson really fight against racism and these WASP idealisms? So let me know if you have any questions about this, but that is going to be a hyperlink on our syllabus for you all to enjoy. We also see the growth and expansion of sport for working class individuals, which again, the Great Depression caused a lot of working class men and women to gravitate towards sport. Their lives were more or less really challenging and emotionally, psychologically miserable. And so as we see a lot in the history of this class, sport is a really good kind of social outlet. It is a distraction for a lot of different things that happen in our American collective and our histories. And so sports, namely softball and billiard halls, were used in many different ways, specifically kind of catered towards the working class who either were unemployed or were working for next to nothing in order to survive. And so in terms of distraction, sports were, again, really good at distracting ourselves from the turmoil of their lives. Billiard halls were really popular, again, due to the Prohibition repeal, because people wanted to spend money on drinks. They wanted to at least alleviate some of the stagnant economic flow and from having the Prohibition. And so they allowed the Prohibition to be repealed. People were drinking more, people were pursuing leisurely pursuits. And so sports billiard halls are really popular, again, because of this repeal. And so this created a resurgence in popularity for professional pool and bowling, in which men and women could participate in. So again, kind of a continuation over the rebelliousness of last week, in which we talked about those sports. In terms of money, professional sport for a living was very possible because, unfortunately, for a lot of folks, there were little to no other job opportunities. And so for people who had no jobs or very few opportunities for work, gambling was also extremely rampant for people who weren't necessarily talented enough to make a living playing sport, but still wanted to make some sort of economic growth. And so gambling became very rampant. And it, again, similarly to drinking, allowed for flow in money in a very stagnant economy that was happening during the Great Depression. And then this was also a time of political leverage. And very interestingly, various ideological and political parties recognized the social leverage that sport gives to American people. And so this was a time that people were, again, very critical of these capitalist, perceivably democratic systems of American society. And so a lot of people recognize that sport can be used to kind of switch people or change people into a different way of thinking. And so the Communist Party organized a Workers' Olympics in Chicago that really emphasized sport participation over competition, which was really kind of representative of a specific ideology of the Communist Party. And so the goal of these Olympics was really try to convert people to communism, and really do so because they were very upset with how capitalism has set them up for financial failure. But unfortunately, it wasn't successful. As kind of a result of that, we have the creation of the Red Scare on the government side, basically demonizing, imprisoning people who went against any capitalistic ideals. And so, although it was unsuccessful, this was a start of seeing how sport can be used, again, for things outside of just sport, that there are power points and power structures and influences that sport can really help or harm certain ideologies with. And so as kind of a continuation of that point, sport was starting to be used as much more of a political tool now than we've seen in previous generations. And so in contrast to maybe what we've talked about before, in which sport was kind of utilized to reaffirm white supremacy through pseudoscience, now we're starting to see that sport is being utilized to explicitly challenge these ideas of white supremacy and anti-Semitism. And so we see this in many different ways. So at the time, again, this was an era of much more greater tolerance towards different religious groups and different religious athletes, aside from Protestantism, from Christianity. And so for Jewish athletes, they utilized sport as a PowerPoint to not only allow for greater acceptance, but to kind of dismantle these ideas of anti-Semitism, that Jewish people are weak and feeble and shouldn't be afforded the same equal opportunity in the United States. And so there's a couple of different examples. One is Maxi Rosenblum. He's kind of nicknamed as Slapsy, and he's a Jewish boxer who defeated German Adolf Hauser in a lightweight match. Because of that, it resulted in Hitler refusing any more German-Jewish matches thereafter, because he was Jewish, very much challenged these ideas that, again, of white supremacy, but also of Jewish dominance. He didn't want anything to do with that, especially leading into, again, the end of World War II with the concerted efforts to exterminate Jewish people in Europe and various nations thereafter. We also see this in the 1936 Olympics, which is kind of more colloquially called as the Nazi Olympics, because this was when Adolf Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. The 1936 Olympics were in Berlin, Germany. And so Hitler, as kind of a result of Maxi Rosenblum, but also just, again, to kind of progress his agenda of anti-Semitism, Hitler banned Jewish athletes from competing with the German team. And so it led to a lot of Jewish protests and civil rights demonstrations. And again, kind of set the precursor to our now, looking back, awareness of what was actually happening, the undercurrent in the systemic displacement and murder of Jewish people, as well as other demographics within Europe at the time. We also see Black athletes challenging these ideas, and Joe Louis and Jesse Owens. So Joe Louis, as I talked about a little bit before, he's an African-American boxer, and so he really represented the struggle of between Black and white boxers. And again, boxing has always kind of been that symbolic sport in which you very much see the visible fighting between two athletes and two, extrapolated ideas or race, these, ideas about these different groups. And so we see that in other forms like football, but it's not necessarily like they're literally fighting each other. That's a little bit more of a symbol as opposed to boxing, which is a very vivid example of fighting and kind of this dominance over others. And so Joe Louis, fantastic boxer during this era. He and German Max Schmeling represented the struggle between Black and white dominance, specifically in sport, but outside of sport as well. And so Schmeling, although he wasn't a Nazi, did represent these ideas of white supremacy, in particular because he was German, also kind of associated him with that ideas of anti-Semitism. But Schmeling won their first bout and really represented a victory for the Nazis and white supremacy. Joe Louis won their second bout before enlisting in the army to fight back against the attacks of Pearl Harbor. And so they never ended up meeting again, but Joe Louis, again, for his dominance as an athlete, really kind of challenged these ideas of white supremacy. Jesse Owens, who is pictured here, also beat many German male athletes in track and field during the 1936 Olympics. And so he dismantled a lot of Aryan supremacist values, white supremacy. However, when Owens returned home to a racist America, he was stripped of his medals for not continuing the European tour because he wanted to go home and spend time with his family. And so he still was met with extreme racism in the United States, even though sport was a way to kind of push back against those systems in which he was still able to be dominant and still even today be thought of as one of the best track athletes that we've ever had. And so with that, the kind of continuing on with our conversations of different sports, and particularly with intercollegiate sport. And so after World War II, a very interesting thing happened in which most colleges felt what we call an athletic boom. And so this happened for many different reasons. The athletic boom was kind of created first because of the GI Bill. So this allowed veterans and their families to attend college at a subsidized rate as kind of a reward for their patriotism, for surviving the war, for, their efforts and true sacrifice for fighting for our nation and our ideals. And so the GI Bill allowed veterans and their families to attend college at a subsidized rate. And so because a lot of soldiers were very good athletes, that allowed them to be a part of these athletic programs. And so athletics departments experienced a huge boom of talented athletes, which made college programs extremely competitive and much more lucrative. And a lot more competitive led to more cheatings and more scandals. And so in 1929, the Carnegie Report found many ethical violations that were happening in collegiate sport. So not necessarily just within collegiate football, but within all available sports in college spaces. And so the Carnegie Foundation was the one who sponsored the investigation. Basically, they were motivated by their ideals and dedication to education, that if you're going to college, you should do so because you want to get an education, not necessarily because you want to be a professional athlete. And so the foundation saw these enormous football profits in particular as a threat to higher education, right? That student athletes were really only wanting to be there for sports and not necessarily to be students. And so this idea of amateurism was kind of losing a lot of pull in a lot of these spaces. And so the commercialization through the NC2A was very problematic because with this athletic boom, Colleges became much more competitive with one another, and so they saw an increase in coaching salaries, extremely large stadiums, boosters, gambling, lucrative recruitment strategies, and subsidization of the athletes themselves. And so all of these different ethical violations against this idea of amateurism basically showed that nobody really cared. Although they found many different ethical violations that went against the ideas of student amateurism, nobody really cared about it. The report didn't necessarily result in any new regulations, nor did it lead to any university sanctions. And so this really kind of showcased that people, especially during this era and even today, much more value the commercialization benefits that can come from college sports as opposed to the altruistic idealisms of being in college sports for the sense that you're getting an education. And so eventually many of the violations were remedied when the NC2A kind of took power over college sports and created its sanctity code, in which it very much established amateurism, that college athletes can't be paid to play. It limited financial aid, so it didn't look like they were paying their athletes. Through scholarships. They also created academic adherences, which is a GPA requirement, which is something that still college student athletes have today. And they had greater control over programs. Eventually, they did away with the code in favor of athletic scholarships and a Corps of Investigator, which still hold PowerPoints today. But essentially, I want us to acknowledge, too, that even with all of these sanctity codes, this oversight, this committee, the investigators that still exist, cheating still happened in a lot of these sports, like basketball and football, which also coincidentally also happened to be the most televised, the most commercialized, what we consider maybe revenue-producing sports. And so we still have a lot of examples in which they had cheating, point shaving, gambling efforts, and more to still allow these sports to be competitive amongst themselves. And so that being said, I want us to now look at our second documentary for the week, which is the Game Day Rivalry, which is where we're really seeing the modern day ramifications of these established systems from the 1920s and 30s. The idea that America combines athletics and academics, but really puts the emphasis on the commercialization of sport because obviously that's where the money is, as opposed to academics. And so Mary Willingham, she's a faculty at UNC. She was the whistleblower who exposed the longest standing academic fraud case in American history. And this really kind of goes back into this idea that, again, yeah, the NC2A wants student athletes to be students first by requiring certain academic requirements like GPA. But as you're going to see, there's a lot of systems in place that still allow cheating to happen while still maintaining these eligibility standards. And so what did Mary expose at her time at UNC specifically? What arguments did she make when talking about how student athlete education is fraudulent? Who is most exploited in this system? And do you think that college student athletes should be paid as kind of ramifications or reparations, for this broken system, as you're going to read about and watch in this documentary? So please let me know if you have any questions about that. But we're going to continue on by talking about this era in which women were fighting for their inclusion in society, but also inclusion through sport. And so although women were still regarded as less than men, sociologically, in sport, in terms of PowerPoints, in terms of gender, they were just as accomplished within various sporting spheres. And in one in particular, which I think is a very interesting part of our lost histories of women in sport, is with baseball. That in 1943, the creation of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was established and lasted until 1954. Professional baseball players were women during this time. And this was created kind of as a necessity because World War II forced, again, a lot of these professional athletes to either go work for the war service industry or to actually go fight on the front lines, either in the Pacific side or the European side of the war. And so there was kind of this vacuum of professional sports during this time because, again, you couldn't field entire men's baseball leagues, football leagues, basketball leagues anymore, because there were so few men that were actually still in the States. And so because of that, a lot of people in this time, again, with our increasingly liberalized view of gender, were like, well, if all things are considered equal, more or less, let's have the women be professional athletes. And so this league lasted over a decade, for 12 years, and the athletes had to adhere to a female decorum of makeup, skirts, and etiquette. So even though they were allowed to be professional athletes, they were thought of as professional athletes in this male-dominated space of baseball, they still had to adhere to gendered expectations of decorum. And so this was an all-white league additionally, so it further drove the division between African American women's acceptance in sport, and those opportunities are extremely limited for that demographic. It is important for us to recognize a notable athlete of Jackie Mitchell, who was a pitcher for the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, who struck out Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth. So she was an extremely dominant pitcher that, again, not a lot of people know about. We also have track and field, in which both black and white athletes were dominant in the sport. We see this through our Olympic accolades. However, little media attention was given to African American athletes. For swimming also was kind of symbolized, a sport that symbolized this newfound freedom for women athletes, in particular with dress. It's also a very highly aerobic sport, so you have to be very physically fit to be able to be a good swimmer. And so Charlotte Epstein is the notable athlete during this time, and she was really a pioneer in establishing the sport for women, and women specifically. She founded many organizations for the sport of swimming, championed with Olympic dominance for decades, and really kind of combated these assumptions of women athleticism, which again, swimming requires a lot of endurance. And so these ideas that the pseudoscience has prevented women from being involved in sporting spaces because the endurance and the overexertion would have caused them to be infertile, we're starting to be dismantled. We're starting to be discredited due to trailblazers like Charlotte. We also have tennis being allowed for women, and really kind of maintained still this middle upper class standard of respectability. They did have many white and black champions, although they weren't necessarily allowed to compete against each other. And so they did have segregated opportunities in which black athletes were allowed to, again, earn an income while playing this sport. For golf, women had been on the links since the 1800s if their wealthy husbands had membership at country clubs in order to play, and that created a lot of dominant athletes, in particular Mildred Babe Didrikson, who won 2 gold medals for track and field in 1934, and then went on to win 10 LPGA tournaments in golf. And so she was an extremely talented athlete in her own right. We also have basketball, which initially had their own women-specific rules, as you saw with the documentary. But as organizations and colleges began to hold tournaments, they started to integrate to using men's rules, often competing against and beating men's teams. And so this was one of the only spaces where we actually had established co-ed competitions between men and women, which subsequently died off because a lot of men didn't like being beat by women in a sport that was historically for them. And so the women's space in sport was and is always continuously being contested, but this is an era that did showcase a lot of female sporting dominance and provide an opportunity for equality. And so all this to say, we are finding that sports and professionalism and money and commercialization truly is growing during this era. And a lot of that is really on the back of technological advancements at this time. This was a time of revolutionary advancements in economic fluctuation that do resemble modern sport today, in which technological advancements, as we're going to talk about, made it easier to watch sport, sensationalize games and athletes, and really opened the door for sports advertisements that we still have today. So in the 1920s, this was the start of the radio boom that really popularized sports of baseball, horse racing, car racing, football, and even boxing. NBC and CBS, which now we kind of think of as like TV conglomerates, maybe even streaming services, they started as radio broadcasting networks. And so they began consolidating the power of these radio outlets into the powerful conglomerates we know them of today, which established monopolies in the media space that we're still kind of dealing with even in the 2020s that we're finding ourselves in now. In the 1930s, this was the start of using photo finish equipment at the Olympics and then subsequently other racing type events like car racing, horse racing, and other things like that. And then in the 1950s, which we're going to just briefly touch on today, we're going to talk more about this next week. This was the start of the television boom. Although rudimentary televisions were around earlier, they were really only afforded to folks who could afford it, very, very wealthy individuals, and they were very few and far in between. But the 1950s does mark the television boom. But again, we're going to talk more about that next week. This was also a time of athlete sponsorships, and so again, we still find ourselves in this space of conflicting athlete values, in which companies would sponsor entire sporting teams, companies took to sponsoring individual star athletes and coaches, and so these athletes started to now represent these values of quality, luxury, and performance of these products, and not necessarily about these ideas of meritocracy and the working class average American. And so a lot of people started to lose favor with these professional athletes. The idea that they were, again, kind of selling out in a sense, that they were now professional, they're getting paid to play sports, as one, opposing to doing it just because of the fun of it, but two, that they weren't really representative of the American people anymore, that most people were not multimillionaires, for the context of this era, multi-thousandaires. And so these ideas weren't really reflective anymore. And so a lot of mainstream Americans kind of fell out of favor with athletes at this time, which again really spurred the hyper awareness and efforts put towards sports writers to kind of, again, fix this perspective and really try to make sports and Americans fall in love with athletes because they still represented these ideals, but really they didn't. We also see for auxiliary spectacles during the Great Depression, a lot of commercialized sport took a massive hit because people didn't have really expendable income. It caused a lot of professional franchises to start offering auxiliary spectacles to try to still get people to watch sports again. And so some of the things that came about during this era are things like double headers, where you'd have 2 games in one day. They would start to play night games so that they can meet people after work, so they were still able to spend money, but not necessarily conflict with that work schedule. They also started to introduce all-star games and increase spectatorships by having playoffs between different leagues. They would have bowl games that would have revised timing rules, and basketball in particular, to make the game more exciting, as well as the creation of the Heisman Trophy, awarding a consequential college player with like the best accolade of their performance, as well as ranking other college players to kind of create one, limited team rosters and salaries, but also two, to kind of create discourse surrounding, oh, so-and-so is better than who, oh, but I saw that they went down in the rankings. And so all these different auxiliary spectacles really started to get people back into watching sports for things outside of just watching the sports itself. And so all of this to say, the popular era culture really kind of changed things in terms of making it much more recognizable to things that are applicable still today. And so in terms of our week review, I want us to remember the sports, the first of the era, right? So during this era, we have the NBA being created, the National Basketball Association, the All-American Girls Baseball League, NCAA March Madness Basketball Tournament, and the Ladies Professional Golf Association, so the LPGA. I also want us to take note of when these professional leagues desegregated. So the NFL in 1946, professional baseball, MLB in 1947, the NBA in 1950, and the NHL in 1950 as well. I also want us to recognize the golden people and why that's in quotations, in which sports writers would attempt to glorify athletes like Babe Ruth and really change these negative perceptions due to the Black Sox scandal, rowdy drinking culture, and the perceived unpatriotic athletes that make up professional sports. We also have collegiate sport issues, right? We talked about the effects of the GI Bill, the Carnegie Report findings, and modern day issues with game day rivalry as kind of a consequence to the NCAA regulating college sports. We also talked about the Berlin Olympics in 1936, who was not permitted to compete for the German team and those repercussions, and then who actually directly challenged anti-Semitism and white supremacy in sports. So take note of those athletes that we covered there. And then briefly, again, just recognize that there were technological effects on sport during this time, which the 1920s are kind of marked by the radio boom. 1930s started to have photo finish equipment. And then in the 1950s, we had the television boom, which again, we're going to get into more detail next week. But it's important to recognize that that's really where it started. So I hope you all had a wonderful time. Next week, we're going to be going over 1950 to 1980, which is considered the post-war era in which we see sport as a TV spectacle, big business, and political site. Please let me know if you have any questions about this week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.